There is a lot coming out in education policy.
Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, around don't panic.
Schools as being the great equaliser.
Trust leaders are incredibly generous.
Can we have certainty that we can deliver it so that our students aren't guinea pigs?
Thank you for joining us today. I'm Natalie Perera. I'm the Chief External Affairs and Communications Officer at AQA. Now, it's an understatement somewhat to say that there is a lot coming out in education policy at the moment. Earlier this year, the Department for Education published its long-awaited Schools White Paper, which set out a series of reforms to the education system. And only a few months before that, the DfE also responded to the Curriculum and Assessment Review, and that set out a bold plan for reforming curriculum and assessment with First Teach starting in 2029. So we're going to be talking to two trust leaders today about what those assessment reforms mean for schools, for trusts, and how they're planning between now and then. I'm delighted to be joined today by Dr. Kay Tinsley, who is Director of Teaching and Learning at the Kemnal Academy Trust. A very warm welcome to you, Kay. And also by Dr. Rick Rhodes, who is Executive Lead for Secondary School Improvement at the Constellation Trust. And a very warm welcome to you. So, first off, tell us a bit about how you're planning for curriculum and assessment reform in 2029. What's going on in your trust? And we'll start with you first, Kay.
Well, there's an awful lot going on in our trust at Kemnal already. With the arrival of our new CEO, Russell Hobby, we have a 7-year strategy, and within that strategy, we're already starting to focus on really creating the right kind of landscape and the right conditions for curriculum reform to land really effectively. So we are looking at building really effective professional learning communities, because what we know is that if curriculum reform is going to be really effective, it's all about the implementation. And what I know as a trust leader working on the ground across 45 schools is implementation will be very varied. And, we have to make sure that leadership capacity is there, that we've grown those leaders, and that we have really carefully sequenced professional development to create the right opportunities for teachers to really engage with the reform that's coming down the tracks. Because as you've already said, Natalie, it's a myriad of different kind of opportunities and change that is coming our way. And there is so much noise in education. So it's about simplifying things, I think. I think school leaders sometimes kind of oscillate between being ostriches and kind of bulls in china shops, So it's either kind of going at it and overwhelming school leaders and teachers with what's coming, or just not doing anything and saying, well, we don't know what it's going to look like till kind of spring 2028, so we're not going to worry about that. So we're not doing that in Kemnal. We're starting to look at the things we can be doing now. So we've been focusing on strengthening Key Stage 3. We are looking, with the appointment of our new academics and enrichment director, we're looking at creating through curriculum, because we have a mix of primary and secondary schools. And our primary schools are stronger in terms of their educational outcomes at the moment. So we're drawing on the experience of our primary colleagues and leaders, and we're going to be creating a through curriculum. we've already worked on that in terms of reading, and had a lot of success with that across the trust. And we're looking at oracy, because that's, very much highlighted within the new curriculum reforms. Literacy, oracy, and strengthening disciplinary literacy specifically, because I think with the knowledge turn in education, there's been a lot of focus on declarative knowledge, but particularly within the history curriculum, as has been identified within the CAR documentation, there hasn't been that kind of rigorous focus on disciplinary literacy. So those are some of the strands that we've already started to look at, and writing as well, which is going to be very important, I think, for schools, and of course transition. So we have a number of our schools that are geographically close. Some of them are more disparate, but we do have some kind of hubs, like in Crawley, where we have a number of our very successful primary schools, and then we have a secondary school. So we're looking at really strengthening transition. So we're looking at how we can more effectively, overcome that transition dip, which has been so well documented over all the time I've been in teaching in the 30 years of my career. That has been a continual issue. So those are just some of the ways we're starting to look at, creating that kind of environment and landscape where the reforms can land.
Thank you. And I think I'd definitely like to come back and talk a bit more about how you're preparing your leadership team, how that's filtering down to schools, and also curriculum sequencing as well. We'll come back to those. But first, Rick, a warm welcome to you. Tell us a bit about how your trust is preparing.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think follow that to some extent, but I think it's the case we're preparing in terms of macro and micro scale. So obviously you've got the large scale changes that need to be done at senior leadership level. So you're looking at the curriculum planning, how the accountability measures, the change in accountability measures are going to impact on our course offer, how we do that in terms of budgetary constraints, what we have to look at in terms of really ensuring that we are set up for whatever comes at 2029 and then onwards. But it's also the case that we need to look in terms of individual subjects. So we have Key Stage 2, 3 and 4 provision and Key Stage 5 provision within our trust. And it's trying to digest the information that came out in the curriculum assessment review and what that looks like for our students, particularly maybe what it looks like for our post-16 students. Will it be the case that we're planning to offer a new tranche of qualifications? How will we offer that tranche of qualifications? How does that then work with our professional development offer? How does that work in terms of what our students receive in terms of their enrichment? These things are all factors that we're trying to attribute and we're trying to be responsive to, whilst also recognising that the details haven't yet been hashed out, and we do need some meat on the bones, particularly when it comes to an individual subject level. So in terms of following that, professional development, in terms of upskilling our senior leadership, really looking at the foundational knowledge, really looking at those core skills, particularly for our Key Stage 3 students, trying to not preempt but understand what those Year 8 reading assessments and mathematics assessments are going to look like, and how we can start to mould our own provision to get ahead of the curve, so to speak.
Thank you. And it's a really good point you make. First, that there is vocational reform underway as well, and that's on a much more tight timetable than general qualification reform. So if you're in a trust that has sixth forms, you're actually needing to think about both pre-16 and post-16 reform. And then secondly, you're doing that in the absence of some of the detail of, when particular subjects are going to be in place and the specifics of the new curriculum and the assessment. How does that work in a trust like yours? How do you kind of oversee change amongst uncertainty?
It's very difficult because obviously the students are undertaking their qualifications as we speak, and any time that we seek to introduce anything new into the curriculum or we seek to introduce any new raft of qualifications, we are effectively potentially jeopardising what our students are going to do and jeopardising the future. So we have to make sure that what we're doing is coherent and we're certain as to what we want to do. So there are a couple of key things that we do. First things first, we make sure that we've got the subject expertise. We can't deliver these qualifications unless we have the people in place to be able to do that. That might be the case of upskilling current staff, or it might be the case of employing new staff. But as I referred to, the financial constraints can sometimes impede on that. The second thing is to look at if it meets the needs of our students, if it meets our local and regional employer priorities, if it's something that we feel we can offer with surety. At that point, we look at what's coming out from the DFE, we look at what's coming out from Ofqual and the awarding organisations. We look at the split of the assessment, 60-40 potentially with the new V levels in terms of the non-examined assessment and the examined assessment. We look at whether we have the infrastructure there to offer that. And also, we look at the surety that we can have in terms of planning for those first tranche of, let's say, V levels in 2027. But we welcome some aspects of what's been said in the curriculum assessment review and what the DFE are doing. The reduction of content for the T levels is going to be massive for the post-16 environment. The fact they were very, very big qualifications, the fact they're going to be smaller means they're going to be much more accessible to students. And having that coherent vocational, academic and technical pathway is going to be a social equaliser for students. It is going to be the case that those 25% of students who aren't sitting an academic or technical qualification are going to have that provision. As we've referred to and alluded to earlier, it'll all depend on what that looks like, how they're going to look at, let's say, for example, the content, including the specification, how that's going to be deliverable for our teachers. And the key thing for us in trusts and education more generally, can we have certainty that we can deliver it so that our students aren't guinea pigs and we're not doing anything that may be adverse for them?
Yeah. Absolutely. And Kay, tell us a bit more. You talked about supporting your leaders, but how do you do that during a time of quite significant change, and thinking particularly about curriculum and assessment reform, where the sector doesn't yet quite have the detail that it would like?
I think it's very, very important to, as I've said, to make sure that you are creating and enabling leaders to create a really sequenced professional development program. And, all good professional development is like a great curriculum. It has to be carefully sequenced without opportunities for teachers to engage in curriculum conversation to really get to understand, and as you're saying, Rick, as well, to develop that subject knowledge and that specification knowledge, then we're not going to have that effective delivery and implementation in our schools. So it is really about making sure that we are creating the right culture and environment for them to do that, and these professional learning communities that are going to support their implementation moving forward. And I think to some extent, because everything that we've heard already is about evolution rather than revolution, that is reassuring. I think some of the difficulties for leaders are actually enabling not only teachers to be upskilled in terms of their subject knowledge and kind of specification knowledge, but it's about helping them with the confidence to make those changes, and also to adapt within their local context, as you're talking about, Rick. I think it's very important, particularly for a number of our schools. They're in coastal contexts, and it's really interesting listening to and reading Alan Milburn's report last week. What we know is that we have a number of students in our schools that are leaving and not transitioning into education and employment. They are being let down to some extent by a curriculum which, has perhaps become a little bit too constrained, because we live in a very performative culture. We're very concerned about exam results, and teachers often, I find, and I have found during my doctoral study, are very anxious about curriculum innovation or stepping outside of, very rigid kind of programs of study and kind of schemes of learning, and building that confidence can be quite difficult. So it's about getting the structures right to remove those barriers. I think that's absolutely critical. So professional learning communities, lots of opportunities. We've engaged this year with Step Lab at Kemnal, and that's really enabling us to create that kind of synergy between curriculum and pedagogy, and to have really spaced professional learning rather than teachers attending kind of, one-off events, where they might be introduced to, new curriculum documentation, and then, there's nothing for several weeks. So actually, professional learning becomes part of the DNA of our schools, and that's very much a kind of turn for our schools this year. So, actually, development and teacher development is happening daily, hourly, rather than in kind of one-off events. And we've created created a high feedback culture this year, very kind of responsive, agile cultures, and we're very much focused on things like adaptive teaching, because that's really key. It's not about having, toolkits, pedagogical toolkits, and not about having curriculum documents. It's about how teachers can really interpret those, be agile on the spot, and that can only happen if they've had those regular professional learning opportunities that have been carefully sequenced for them.
Thank you. And Rick, Kay mentioned a really important report that came out recently from Alan Milburn in his interim report. How important do you think the curriculum and assessment review, including the accountability changes, are to tackling some of the problems that Alan Milburn set out in his report?
I think the intent that sits behind the curriculum assessment review is one that most in education would be fully behind. This notion of modernising the curriculum, this notion of, circumcise all of the things that no longer need to be taught. This idea of an assessment that is pared down slightly, but still with the same rigour and authenticity. I think all of these things in headline, in broadly, are what we would be asking for. I think the key issue is implementation, and Kay referred to it before. And I think the thing that we want in Trust, and the thing that'll be really interesting in Trust, is to see how all these varied principles and these varied ideas can be functionalised into something that is deliverable and that we can then implement within our schools. I have no doubt in terms of the things that are on offer, upskilling in terms of digital, financial literacy, these things are absolutely essential for young people in modern society, but particularly those students who maybe wouldn't receive that education at home, or maybe wouldn't be getting that from any other source. And this is where I refer to schools as being the great equaliser. This notion that there is going to be a parachute when students are 16, there'll be greater provision for recent English and maths when they enter into post-16 education. This notion of a varied and diverse pathway post-16, and this notion that the education they're receiving from 11-16 is purposeful, it's effective, it's what they're crying out for, and it's truly transformative. I think if those things can be realised, or some of those things can be realised, we will see that paring down of, the NEET population, and as we've seen recently, 1.5 million young people who aren't in education, employment or training. I think that these things will be transformative. I think everything will come down to how the DfE work with Ofqual, work with the awarding organisations, and then work with the schools to be able to make sure that the intent that sits behind the curriculum assessment review is deliverable, and it achieves those rather, grand but absolutely desirable aims that it articulates. And
you talked about how all of the different parts of the system work together at national level, so the DfE, Ofqual, and the awarding organisations. What do you think is the role of trusts like yours in working with schools to kind of get that message out, to make sure they understand the direction of travel, to make sure they're prepared? How are you doing that?
I think in terms of the job that we do at trust level, it's essential, because what we're able to do is we're able to some extent act as almost a translator, sitting not atop the schools. We work within the schools. We are, we're a part of the school, or an organism within the school. It's the case of just having that notion of someone who has the time, the preparation, the ability to digest all of that information, and then try to, as best possible, institute practice or professional development or whatever it may be that can be used for practical, proper implementation within the schools. There may be best practice pedagogical strategies. There may be something that can be delivered at that headline level that, when it's referred to on the ground, is almost the trust doing its job, so to speak.
Great, thank you. And Kay, you talked about some of the support that your trust is able to offer to schools. Do you think that that's replicable in trusts that maybe are smaller or have fewer resources? How do you think different size and scales of trusts might deal with that challenge?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think what's exciting about the school system and the kind of educational landscape at the moment is the extent to which trusts are no longer working independently and in their own silos. Working with CST, reaching out to different trusts, working together to kind of share knowledge, build knowledge, has really been an exciting part of my work over the last few years. I think increasingly Chemnall is working much more effectively with other trusts so that we can build that expertise and knowledge together. And I find that trust leaders are incredibly generous. I think that we are all committed to the young people that we work with, and we want the very best for all of them. And I think the solutions are, I remember listening to Estelle Morris a few years ago, and she said very clearly that, the solutions are out there. It's just about us all coming together to build those solutions together. And I think during this time of massive change, we've got kind of white papers around SEND, and we've got CAR, and Alan Milbourne's, and there's so much going on. We have to work together more effectively, and that's where you can see smaller trusts drawing on the expertise of larger trusts, and us all learning from each other to improve the outcomes of all of the children that we work with.
What does good collaboration look like across trusts, and thinking particularly about the areas of curriculum and assessment?
I think it has to be symbiotic. I think it has to be mutually beneficial. I think it has to be the case that everyone is getting something from it. Obviously, that goes without saying. But it also has to rely on expertise. We can't all be experts in everything. So it may be the case, and as Kay refers to, there may be silos of expertise. We've got fantastic provision in our trust for SEND. So it's the case that we will do some outreach work within the locality to look at, refine those processes. And it's the ability, and I really like this idea of the ability to rely on the appropriate networks at the time for the thing that you may need them for. So we know, for example, within our trust, we've got some fantastic primary provision, and it's the case that our effective primary teachers will then work with our Year 7 teachers, our Key Stage 3 teachers, to give that through provision. So in terms of summarising the question, it's basically keeping the student at the forefront of your mind and making sure that all of the provision is referred into that as a way to make sure that collaboratively you're working together to achieve that end.
Thank you, Rick. And Kate, tell us a bit about, again, on the topic of curriculum and assessment reform. You said that you are talking to school leaders about it already, which is great. What kind of questions are they asking you?
There are quite a few questions about Progress 8. Because obviously we've had to start thinking with the current Year 8s, because they will be, taking new specifications and examinations first. So we've had to start talking about that, because there are some implications already around, as you've alluded to, around staffing. When we're looking at things like triple science and those kinds of entitlements. They're mainly asking questions about that at the minute. I think it is partly about reassuring school leaders that lots of the things that we are doing, and you were talking, Rick, about foundational knowledge. We're focusing in all of our schools, looking at foundational knowledge. It's about really highlighting the things that they are doing already, which are preparing them for curriculum, and their schools for curriculum reform. One of our schools has just had a very successful Ofsted inspection, and actually the work that they have done last year, very much around adaptive teaching, absolutely on point when you're creating the right conditions for curriculum reform. And that's, absolutely right when you're building that kind of bridge, I suppose, between curriculum coherence and teacher autonomy. It's really critical that you focus on that. And this year they've been very much focused on oracy, which has been absolutely critical. But you see that wonderful synergy between curriculum and pedagogy. So it's about reassuring school leaders that they are doing the right things, the things that we know students need to focus on. Just coming back to Alan Milburn's report, and some of the things that have been identified by CAR as lacking within schools, and within his report. It's that focus on those kinds of skills that are really critical for the workplace. And what we know with AI and this exciting technological change that we're in, is that students are going to really need those skills more than they have ever done before. But, I think that possibly some of the generic focus on pedagogy in schools over the last few years, because of the DfE's golden thread and initial teacher training, has perhaps been very much around knowledge-rich curriculum, that kind of, retrieval practice, that kind of delivery. And some of those skills, like oracy, have not been built into the kind of, learning and classroom environment in the way that they really need to be in order for young people to develop. But, the dialogic learning and opportunities I see as absolutely critical. So, I think it's about reassuring school leaders that they are doing the right things. These are things which are going to prepare them when they are asking questions, about what is it going to be? Is it going to be this? Is it going to be that? We're doing the right things already.
That, as you mentioned, there are some specific things that have come out from both Becky France's review and the Alan Milburn review about readiness for the world of work and world generally. So, and they're things that we at AQA strongly get behind. So improving young people's digital literacy and their financial skills as well. What do you think that means for the school workforce? Do we have a workforce that's kind of equipped to teach children those types of skills?
I think that is a fascinating question. I absolutely think it's really interesting. I've been reading quite a lot recently about a kind of widening gap between private schools and state schools in terms of teacher education specifically around using AI and how we can use AI with our students. I think there are some trusts that are a little bit further ahead than we are at Chemnall in terms of upskilling teachers to really teach kind of digital literacy and even financial literacy, although that's something we're starting to kind of explore as part of our 7-year strategy. I think we absolutely need to look in the state system specifically at how we are going to upskill the workforce in terms particularly of AI. I mean, we've started to use things like OLEX, to mark, and we're kind of looking at, that's just for English. Our English lead has been absolutely on that one. But we're starting to look at that for other subjects as well. And I think, just in terms of formative assessment and, how we can better enable students to make really rapid progress, these are all things that we really need to start looking at. So, I think that's a really interesting question.
And Rick, what's your view on the question of whether the workforce is ready? And is it something you're thinking about in your trust?
100%. And it's the case. It's interesting, the auspicious timing of the CAR review, because these questions are already being asked. It is the case that when students are completing their non-examined work, the questions about AI come up, and questions about whether students have used AI, etc. And the Joint Centre of Qualifications have got some guidance, but it's not stringent guidance. And I know the awarding organisations have taken positions, but those positions, when you actually put them in practice, lack in terms of application. So I think my answer would be, effectively, not yet, but given time, as we have the chance to upskill and this becomes more embedded within the curriculum, and as this becomes a more formalised process, it will be the case that teachers will flock to this, because what we know is that the moment something is instituted and the moment it becomes practice, people will develop the necessary skills to do so. So I think it's a journey, and I think it's the case that we're on the start of a very interesting journey. It's the same way that the internet would have been treated in terms of versus textbooks. Currently, because it's such a novelty and because it's such uncharted territory, there can be a sense of trepidation and fear. But I think as it becomes more embedded in our process, and as we become understanding in terms of the way we use it, I think it'll become the true learning tool that it is.
And what do you think might get in the way of delivering curriculum and assessment reform?
Practicality and certainty, and teachers feeling confident in the ability to do this. We have very broad headings such as digital literacy, financial literacy, and as Kay referred to, those things are happening within schools, be it in citizenship or be it in computer science qualifications. What the teachers will need in terms of the confidence in delivering, what we'll need in terms of trust leaders, is a real clear estimation of what the expectations on us are in terms of our delivery, what it is that students are expected to know, how they are expected to be assessed on it, how the components will be broken down, and what the end point should be as a consequence of that. As I referred to previously, the intent that sits behind all of these reforms is absolutely altruistically positive. And again, as a school leader, this is something that we can all get behind. What we need as the people on the forefront of practice, with the students directly in front of us, is the ability to say with confidence, this is how we deliver digital literacy. This is what the government priorities are on digital literacy, and this is how we feel it's going to benefit our students. Once we have that certainty from the awarding bodies with specifications, or from, as I say, any subsequent reportage, I feel it can only be a positive thing. It is just that transitioning from the theory, where it currently exists, into real definitive, clear practice. And
presumably, Kay, that applies across the subject reforms across the curriculum. Do you think there's anything else that might get in the way of delivering curriculum and assessment reform?
Yeah, I do. My lived experience as a school leader, and I'm a former secondary head and have now been teaching for 30 years. But my experience as a trust leader, and specifically really during my doctorate, is that there is space, for example, within the curriculum at the minute to, say for example within my subject, to diversify, to engage with a much, which is absolutely a theme that runs through the curriculum reform, that we want schools to be able to adapt to local contexts. So for example in my subject, you want students to be able to read poetry from Liz Berry. If you're in Birmingham, or if you're in Peckham in London, you want to be reading Caleb Femi. However, what we find is that even with those opportunities to diversify the curriculum, that often English departments and schools don't actually engage with different texts. And that's been very evident. Last year, AQA introduced a new poetry anthology, and there were only, talking to your head of product, there were only 20,000 students who actually wrote in the exam about the new anthology, whereas 380,000, I think, continued to actually write about what has now become on kind of national text. AQA has about 80% of market share for English GCSE. So we've got, most of the students in the country studying the same set of poems for the English literature GCSE. So, even when, AQA provide those opportunities, the challenge is, how do we then upskill teachers? How do we give them opportunities to have those curriculum conversations? How do we enable them to have the confidence to step outside of what they may have been doing for a long time and to take a bit of a risk and do something slightly different? And I think with the pressure, and particularly still on, English will always be king with maths, absolutely essential in terms of Progress 8 with the double weighting. It's difficult for trusts, and there is that kind of tension between curriculum coherence and entitlement. And when we are building kind of through curriculum within Kemnal, we're very aware that what we don't want is kind of, standardisation, which basically leads to absolute, lack of autonomy for schools. But how do you, even when you create the circumstances that will enable them to adapt depending on their circumstances, how do we actually get them to do that? Because what we're seeing, with something just like, the poetry within AQA is, it's really difficult to get teachers to do something different. I mean, I've been teaching and in spectacles for 30 years. And, my goodness, can you imagine actually moving to something different? So great that we've got evolution rather than revolution, but we've got to create the right circumstances and, the right kind of curriculum conversations, the right professional development. We've got to support teachers with resources. They will always say that, but, where are the resources? They need that certainty. They need to feel this is what I'm supposed to be doing. There's a lot of anxiety. We have a lot of anxiety within the system, and that's partly to do with accountability. And I think that's trust leaders, that's individual teachers, that's school leaders. So it is a massive challenge, and I think that's where we can all work together to look at ways of creating that certainty. It's important that create those resources, we create those support mechanisms, and that we're working together on this to create a better system for our children.
Rick, what is your kind of answer or approach to the question of how do we build teacher confidence to A, deal with uncertainty, and B, adapt to a more diverse curriculum, for example?
I think we have to look at the positives. So in the curriculum assessment review, there's a notion about a reduction in overall exam time, 10%, so 2 to 3 hours, which will be better for students. But there is the converse anxiety to that, which is now I have to use all of this time to put all of this information in the student's head, and they have less time to deliver it in the exam. Will it just be wasted material? I think staff will have anxiety about modernisation of the curriculum, because if it's the case that that's going to be iterative over a number of years, will that be found in the specification? How commonly are we going to modernise the information, get rid of the old, bring in the new? There are lots and lots of uncertainties. And I think that the only thing that you can do when it comes in terms of staff professional development and the conversation is, as long as you are building that framework of support that sits underneath, the uncertainty that comes in the future will challenge together. The fact is, and it's easy to say this, but it's true, we are all in the same boat when it comes to these reforms. We are all apprehending them as they come through. And all we can do is build that supportive infrastructure that sits behind it. So when these reforms bear fruition, we know what we're going to do, who's responsible, who's going to be leading on X, Y, and Z. Because the reality is, whenever you've got novelty, whenever you've got reform, whenever you've got something exciting developing the curriculum, and we've all been crying out for this, you can't say, we want something new, our students need less time in exams, we want a new academic pathway, but we want everything to stay the same as well. Those two things don't transpire together. So I think it's the notion of reform and novelty and innovation are exciting things, and as long as we are fielding this together in a supportive environment, collaborative trust, collaborative approach, everyone involved in that, the awarding organisations, Ofsted, whomever it may be, then there's not too much to be scared by and a lot to be excited for.
On that final point, Rick, what gives you optimism, thinking particularly about curriculum and assessment review and reform?
I can see the green shoots of coherence that are coming through. So if we talk about particularly, start with the post-16 environment, a vocational, academic and technical pathway is exactly right for the students in this country. You've got the students who want to do a more vocational, job-oriented qualification. You've got technical, allowing them to specialise in one area, and academic for those who want a diversity of theory-based qualifications. When we look at our Key Stage 4 provision, the things that AQA, for example, are doing with the data insights, the things that we're doing in terms of formative assessment, the support that we're getting, these are all enabling our Key Stage 4 students to improve. Key Stage 3, the reading and maths, the literacy and numeracy tests. These are the opportunity to standardise those and give a level of objectivity to things that would have been going on in some disparate provision across the school. So what you can see is a level of coherence and a level of through theory that works perfectly. So these are fantastic things. How it will transpire, how we will implement this as practitioners, these are the exciting things to come. But if it's the case that we can get anything close to what's being promised in terms of the curriculum assessment review, it's a very, very bright future.
That's really interesting to hear and very, very optimistic. Thank you. And Kay, what gives you optimism when it comes to curriculum and assessment reform? I
feel very excited by the introduction of the new vocational kind of qualifications. I am probably most excited by a sense of the reform, as you're saying, Rick, really being about looking at how we really build concepts over time. I like the way that I think that that CAR is pointing towards things being trimmed down a little bit in terms of content, and actually that focus really on, disciplinary knowledge, I think is very exciting. Just enabling us really now to strengthen Key Stage 3, I think, and we know Mary Myatt's just got a new book out. I mean, absolutely, Key Stage 3, in my lived experience, we were very focused actually on Key Stage 3 when we had SATs. And I was first a head of English when we introduced like the national literacy strategy, across the country. And what was really interesting about that was we had lots of documents, and lots of it was incredible. It was absolutely brilliant, but it was really about how it was implemented, and that wasn't perhaps as effective as it might have been. So I'm really excited by that renewed focus on Key Stage 3, I think, which is going to be inevitable. And I'm really excited by that focus on, digital literacy, financial literacy, oracy as well, those kinds of skills that are really going to enable young people to become adept for the 21st century workplace, because I think that we need to resume our attention, return our attention to that. So lots that I'm really looking forward to.
Thank you. And it's really interesting that you both spoke about that renewed focus on Key Stage 3, where we have seen standards decline a bit. And at the same time, we see this rise in poor mental health amongst young people at that age, particularly amongst girls. Beyond what the government's already announced for Key Stage 3, what else would you like to see, Rick?
I think it's really difficult for Key Stage 3 because primary students leaving year 6, it's exciting, you have your SATs, it's the case of that you come into that denouement of that educational period. You haven't hit the sort of more pressurised regimen of the Key Stage 4, and so you don't have that focus. And this is why I think Key Stage 3 is really, really difficult in terms of it almost being, and it's been referred to as a lost 2-3 years. Exactly that. And I think it's difficult because you don't want to invite focus through accountability. So it's not the case that we want to say, well, we're going to take Key Stage 3 really seriously, so we're going to have these standardised statutory assessments in place. I think, if I'm being honest with you, the introduction of these micro-formative summative assessments are going to be really, really positive because it will give a focus in terms of this is where you are, these are avenues of improvement, this is the stage that you've reached on your journey. And I think that that's going to be quite transformative for those years. In terms of anything else, I think this notion of really developing those skills, really exciting education that we've seen with the curriculum assessment review, trying to give them these digital and financial literacy, trying to give them a really exciting stage of education is something that we can be hopeful for.
And I think what I'm hearing from you is we can do assessment without accountability. Those two things don't need to go hand in hand.
And this, for me, I mean, you don't have to speak to an educationalist long to hear them talk about formative assessment, but there is a notion that these are things that we are doing all the time. We're tracking, we're using our summative endpoints, as I say, through things like data insights to inform our practice, to improve the education of our students. Formalising it to some extent I'm not against, in as much as it will give that level of objective standard across the country whereby maybe there were varying standards previously at Key Stage 3.
Rick, you talked a bit about data insights, you mentioned that. Tell us a bit about what more data might be helpful to schools and trusts, and perhaps how AQA may help with that.
The reason a platform such as Data Insights is so useful is because it allows you to go to the source, the objective data. It allows you to reflect on your practice. How successful were you with your students in the previous year? Formative assessment is fantastic. The information that we gather from it is very useful, but the fact is when students have sat the exam, they've achieved the grade, it's been marked by AQA markers, you know that is as close to an approximation of certainty of performance as you can get. So in terms of that, the ability to cross-reference against similar centres, all AQA awarding centres, it's a fantastic tool that I know I heavily use within my practice to drive improvement. One thing that we've done within our trust in terms of post-16 is we've curated a post-16 professional development system around data insights, exam insights, looking at those high-frequency topics and looking at the areas on a granular question level that you were particularly less strong at, and obviously strong at in previous year, to try to drive that improvement. In terms of improving the system, the only thing that we could look to is perhaps a longer form analysis, a more longitudinal analysis, looking at across all national comparators, not just AQA centres, albeit that may not be possible.
Message received. Great. We're coming up to our final question now. And that is, if there's one thing that you would like school and trust leaders to take away from our discussion today, what would that be? And I will come to you first, Kay.
I kind of thinking about that line in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, around don't panic, it's, I think it's about reassuring trust leaders and school leaders specifically that actually so much of what they're doing already is preparing the groundwork for, a really effective landing of curriculum reform. So, if schools are absolutely focused on reading, which many of them have been because of the last iteration of the Ofsted framework, if they're focused on, oracy, if they're focused, on disciplinary literacy, lots of these things that they're doing already are going to be standing them in really good stead for what's coming. So I think it would be about just trying to reassure them that it will be absolutely fine if we all have the outcomes of our children and their life chances at the centre of everything we're doing, and if we continue to work together, then it will be fine. So don't panic would be my message.
Thank you. Rick, Kay says don't panic. What's your key takeaway for the sector?
I'm not going to panic. No, I think that's absolutely right. I couldn't agree more. I think these are changes that in many respects, in certain aspects, we've been crying out for years. A greater degree of coherence, a greater degree of certainty. There is still some work to do in terms of how we're going to balance the changes to assessment that are upcoming with things such as the authenticity, reliability, and making sure that these assessments are rigorous. But that is work that will happen, and I like the word Kate, iteratively. It is the case that this is going to be a process of refinement. We've seen whenever anything is introduced that is novel, it may take a year or two to try to figure out how that's going to be implemented, how it's going to work. I refer earlier to the T-levels. It was the case that they were instituted a couple of years ago. They realised that the qualifications were too large, and now they've sought to restrict the content in them. These things will happen over time. We do, and again, I really like this point that Kay referred to, we have to recognise that whatever we do, it is just in the best interest of ensuring that our students have the most purposeful, emancipatory education as is practically possible. And I think that these changes are going to engender that as we move forward. So I'm again, optimistic.
Thank you both so much for your time and insights today. Please remember you can find more information and resources on our AQA website and on our social media channels. Thank you.